Hello and welcome to our webinar today, Staying Nonpartisan During Voter Engagement. I appreciate everyone who is joining us, and if you didn't hear the recording earlier, we are recording this webinar. We are going to send you the slides, the recording. We will make sure questions you have get answered. We're going to have a packed webinar because this is always such an important and interesting topic. So I want to get started. On the next slide, I have just a quick plug. Have you signed up for National Voter Registration Day yet? This year, National Voter Registration Day will be on September 20th, and it is National Voter Registration Day's 10th birthday or 10th anniversary. It was started in 2012. And our goal this year is to bring the total number of registrations under the NVRD banner up to 5 million. So we need your help. We need you to sign up as partners, get free posters and stickers, and promote the holiday and voter registration opportunities where you are. All right, today's presenter, I'm very excited to welcome back David Levitt. He has been doing these webinars with us for, I think, at least 5 or so years now. I was watching the video from the 2017 webinar the other day. So I'm pleased to have David, whose practice focuses on the representation of nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations, with an emphasis on program-related investments, social enterprise, political advocacy, and nonprofit corporate governance. Hi, David, how are you?
Hi, Kaylin, great to see you. I can't believe, really, 2017, that the time has flown, but I do like that you continue to use my old picture, because I keep getting older, but I'm staying the same age, at least when I join the webinar. So happy to get started.
Great. So I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A box, and I might butt in with a question or two. Folks are saying hi in the chat. Hello, everyone. But David, will let you get started.
Terrific. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. This was a big year. 2020 was a big year. 2021, 2022. We're obviously approaching midterms. But apparently we are still discussing, and in some cases still disputing, the results from 2020. So we have an election that's not quite over. We have an election coming up. There's a New York Times article just today about the current status with respect to the disputing the election integrity of the 2020 election. And on top of that, we've had a number of big recent Supreme Court decisions, of which I'm sure everyone on this call is aware. So there is a lot that charities may want to talk about and to mobilize the vote with respect to the upcoming elections. So here's the agenda. This is what we will cover. And I'll jump right in rather than you read. You can see we'll cover the items on this slide. One thing I like to do is just at the outset say a little bit about what we will not cover, so everyone understands the context here. One is I'm going to address the IRS rules, the Internal Revenue Code rules for organizations that are tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So that means that I am not talking about the rules that govern other types of exempt organizations. I'm happy to answer quick questions, but there are C4 social welfare organizations that do a lot of action in legislative and political areas, and there are political organizations. This webinar is going to focus on charities, 501c3. Secondly, I'm going to focus on the U.S. tax law governing charities. We're not talking about federal, state, or local election or campaign finance laws. To the extent a charity is staying out of political work to stay in compliance with its tax exemption requirements, it may not have any federal, state, or local election or campaign finance things to worry about, but that's something separate that needs to make sure that that it does not have any election law requirements. We're going to focus on the tax law requirements for charities. And the last but not least, we're talking about candidate related activities today. So we could entirely do session on legislative lobbying, which is subject to separate rules under the Internal Revenue Code. We will talk briefly about ballot measures because those are voted on in an election, but we are going to be talking about candidate-related activities. So with that, we can advance the slide. So we're going to talk about partisan campaign activity and, of course, what we want to avoid for a charity. So what we'll first start with let's start right with the law where it all starts with, if you could advance the slide. One more. This is here we're going to talk about what nonprofits cannot do. It all generates or originates with this section of the Internal Revenue Code in 501c3. This is the Johnson Amendment. For those of you who do not recognize him, that is President Johnson. This is the basics of the electioneering prohibition. The prohibition, it originates with the Internal Revenue Code that was adopted in 1954. It's commonly referred to as the Johnson Amendment because it was then Senator Johnson who proposed this prohibition be added to the tax code. And so that's the language in the code. We're going to talk about what does that mean. Most obviously, this provision means that a charity cannot endorse or support a candidate or political party. So the first two here are the low-hanging fruit, right? Charities cannot endorse or support a candidate or political party. They cannot make contributions or donate money to support a candidate or political party. But with respect to other election-related activities, the question is whether or not the activity is partisan or nonpartisan, and the IRS will consider all the facts and circumstances in determining whether a campaign intervention has occurred, whether or not partisan election-related activity has occurred. So it's not that all election-related activity is forbidden, it's just that it must be done in a nonpartisan fashion. One thing I will say is that the activities that are considered impermissible for a charity, it is broader than those activities regulated under federal state election law. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It's not as if a charity can say, well, we didn't explicitly endorse or oppose a candidate, so therefore we're not engaged in political activities as far as the Internal Revenue Code is concerned. The IRS takes a broader view and says, we're going to look at all the relevant facts and circumstances. And over time, the IRS has given us some guidance on the types of facts and circumstances that it considers relevant. But let's advance the slide, because one of the goals, I think, of this webinar is to really understand what you can do, because there's quite a bit that charities can do in connection with an election, as long as they're paying attention to this question of whether or not their activities are being conducted in a nonpartisan manner. So we're going to talk about each of these: voter registration, education, candidate engagement, and get out the vote. So very broadly, what does it mean to be nonpartisan? But nonpartisan means that the activity is not biased for or against any candidate and is not structured to help or hurt any candidate's chances for election. So we can conduct these activities if they're done so in a means that is intended to educate people or to get people out to vote, but are not conducted in a way that's biased towards or against any of the candidates. So what we're looking for, and again, the IRS considers all the facts and circumstances, is we're looking to see if the activity in some way encourages voters to support or oppose a particular candidate or show some bias towards that candidate. It's important to understand there's no real comprehensive statutory guidance on what nonpartisan means. So over the years, the IRS has issued guidance, and that's all what we really have to go on is the IRS guidance indicating specific facts and circumstances that we'll consider relevant. The most recent relevant, I feel like I have been doing this a while because I remember this revenue ruling came out in 2007. There was a revenue ruling 2007-41 that covers broadly different election-related activities that a 501c3 charity can engage in, and what factors will turn that activity into a partisan activity. But 2007 is no longer as recent as it was when I first started doing these webinars. A lot has changed. Use of social media. I'm just trying to, or I'm not even sure, frankly, when Facebook started, but it seems to me a lot, at least with respect to usage, a lot of things people are using now didn't even exist in 2007. And that's really, in terms of an all-encompassing revenue ruling, that's some of the more recent guidance. So even with the recent guidance, we're still talking about over 10 years ago. And if the situation has not been addressed in IRS guidance, or by a court, we try to reason by analogy. So we do use this guidance and then apply this guidance to all different situations, including voter guides, candidate appearances, forums, and try to understand what the IRS will consider nonpartisan and what it won't. But whereas we have rulings for things like forums and debates, we don't have as much guidance on things like Facebook and Twitter. So we try to take the guidance we have and apply it to the technology as how people are doing their advocacy work evolves. Okay, so I think with that, we can move to the next slide and talk about voter registration. So voter registration, again, charitable organizations can conduct this activity. The key is going to be, how do you do it in a nonpartisan fashion? It's important to understand that with respect to charitable activity, it is a legitimate charitable activity both to educate voters on issues. Voter education can be a legitimately charitable activities, as well as encouraging people to participate in the electoral process, either through voter registration or, as we'll talk about, get out the vote. That is all legitimate charitable activity. So we just need to do it in a way that is nonpartisan. So if you go to the next slide here, this slide will list some common nonpartisan activities that can be done, that charities can do these things without having to be concerned about violating this candidate electioneering prohibition. One thing I should say, I don't have a slide on this, but just to give some background for charities, as I showed you the Johnson Amendment earlier, any candidate-related partisan activities is not permissible for a charity. What does that mean? What it means is if the IRS audits, there can be a tax imposed on those expenditures of 10% on those expenditures, but much more and then those activities need to be corrected, so the tax would need to be paid. But more importantly, it is possible for an organization to lose its tax-exempt status if it engages in partisan candidate-related activities. So that's why this is so important. The IRS does have the ability to revoke tax-exempt status, and having been through a number of audits, even if the organization is subject to an audit, if it engages in activities or activities that are questionable to the point where the IRS decides to audit, an audit is not an enjoyable experience. It takes time and money to get through, even if you get a successful result. So there are many reasons to make sure that the organization is in compliance and not flouting these rules because of the potential risk with respect to its tax-exempt status and the possibility of an audit. Okay, with that, this slide lists some specific activities that are common nonpartisan activities. Happy to answer any questions about these, but in the interest of time, I think we can go to the next slide and just go over, what the key things you want to avoid, which, as I said at the outset, obviously no endorsements are permitted. And what I think is important is the nuances. So obviously no explicit endorsements, but we need to avoid any implicit endorsements as well, or support or bias towards a candidate. So knowing the state's rules, educating people on the state's rules, as indicated on the slide with respect to eligibility requirements and training requirements. Voter registration is largely governed by state law and varies from state to state. C3 charities can encourage and assist those who are eligible to register to vote. That is acceptable C3 activity. Once voters are registered, C3 organizations may want to encourage them to actually vote when election day arrives. That is also something that can be done. So, and if we go, I think we can go forward another slide, maybe even two. So now, so we're going to talk a little bit about the process for voter education and getting out the vote in addition to voter registration. One thing I should note also, the rules I'm describing in terms of voter registration, these are for public charities. The charitable world is very basically divided into two categories: public charities and private foundations. Private foundations and public charities generally are both subject to the same restrictions on no candidate-related partisan activities. However, private foundations have their own more strict rules regarding voter registration. So if anybody is advising or working with a private foundation on voter registration, well, it says there will be you'll need to speak to legal counsel. There are additional strict rules that need to be followed. That being said, why don't we move on to the next slide? This slide shows again, things that your organization can do to engage in getting out the vote without violating the electioneering prohibition. You can provide voter assistance. You can make people aware of the elections. You can offer rides to the polls or provide information about where and how to vote and other information individuals you think may be helpful for them on election day. Phone banks and text banks are permissible. The key is the activities are designed to help people get registered or get to the polls or to help them with the actual voting process. The key is that you're going to be helping everybody and not just organizations or individual voters who seem to be favorable or unfavorable towards your organization's position. So the point is you're helping everybody vote, and you need to provide the voter registration and the get out the vote assistance across the board for everybody who needs that help. So if you can go to the next slide. The process of voting, again, this is another slide that explains more about things that charities can do. And again, the key is that all of these things, you're providing this information to everybody that you reach out to on a nonpartisan basis. So in terms of the process of voting, get out the vote, this is a side of things you can do. I think as summary is to understand that both the content of the message and the targeting of the message need to be done on a nonpartisan basis. So with respect to the content of the message, this slide sort of gets to that in terms of this is general information, how to find your polling place, when and where to vote. What you need to be careful of is starting to mix that message with issue advocacy. If you have a specific issue your charity cares about, it gets more complicated and increases the risk if you start to mix that message with the get out the vote message of just general nonpartisan information about the election. And you have to think about that both in the content of the message and also the targeting who you're sending that out to vote. So things you want to do, you want to, of course, make sure in engaging this activity that you're following all the local and state rules regarding any voter registration drives or voter related activities. You can provide information that is nonpartisan, and you want to train your staff and volunteers to participate and provide nonpartisan information, because what you don't want them to do is to, if part of what you are doing is getting the vote out, helping people get registered or getting them to the polls, you cannot in that same message express support or opposition to a candidate. We often tell people this is not the time to be wearing campaign buttons or t-shirts or things that would suggest support to a particular political party. You don't want to suggest which party to affiliate with or which candidate to vote for. And I think this is important to train your staff to provide nonpartisan information, even if they are asked about their politics or on an issue or who to vote for. They are there to register voters who want to vote. You do not want to editorialize in these communications about whom to vote for. And you certainly don't want to deny the information or the services based on a preference, based on either a preference towards a candidate or a preference on an issue. The information should be provided across the board, regardless of how you expect the voters to vote. Where there would be risk is if you are encouraging voters to register or to vote only on one side of the issue. And so that's in the IRS. I mentioned that revenue ruling 2007-41. This is actually an area that is covered in that ruling. What that ruling does is give a number of examples in different areas of campaign related activity. And one of those areas involves voter registration. And in one example, the organization educates the public on environmental issues and also establishes a telephone bank to call voters in the district. Now, if the concern is if you are going to start to mix that environmental message with the voter registration, that you can turn a nonpartisan voter registration activity into a partisan activity. And the example given provides that the organization calls voters, talks about their views on a particular issue, and then only continues the conversation and provides voter registration information to those who agree with the organization's views. So in other words, if somebody is not in agreement, you end the call. But if you continue for those of the people you call who are in agreement, if you continue the call, give information about the upcoming election, et cetera, that would all be nonpartisan information. But because you are treating people differently based on their response to an issue, the IRS considers that now to be political activity. So you need to treat everybody across the board equally. If you're going to mix an issue with the voter registration, you need to make sure not to telegraph how to vote based on that issue or favor certain voters over others based on their viewpoints and responses on those issues. Here's an interesting point. A charity, however, may target specific populations based on the fact that they're typically underrepresented at the polls. The IRS has ruled on this. So for instance, the charity could actually target low-income communities, minority communities, areas that have historically low voter turnout, or specific populations like students that they tend to cater to. You can target those populations if there is, because there is a reason to do so that's unrelated to how they're going to vote. Even if that group, whether it's low income or student population, et cetera, even if that group is statistically more likely to vote Democratic or vote for one candidate over the other, that has actually been, those are people that it's either part of the natural constituency for the charity, or it's a group that's historically underrepresented at the polls. You can encourage those people to vote, even if statistically they do tend to vote one way or the other. But you can't target groups based on belonging to a political party or because they voted a particular way in the past, or because they vote in a district where it's a very close district. We sometimes refer to as battleground states. If you start to focus only on locations where the election you think the outcome is significant, then that makes activity look more partisan than nonpartisan. So I think with that, we would start talking about candidate engagement, but do we want to ask any questions on get out the voter registration activities or anything that you want me to cover before we move on to the next topic?
Yes, we are getting questions. We have a lot of questions especially about engaging candidates, and some questions about what staff can do in their personal time. So everyone who had those questions, we're going to get to that. And if there are outstanding questions, we'll answer those. But the questions that really are about voter registration, there are a few. So Mercedes has asked, if we have a voter registration event and we invite both dominant political parties, but only one responds, could this be problematic? Yes, so that is the topic we also cover in the next section, but let me just jump right to it with respect to candidate engagement. Anytime you're inviting a candidate to any event, whether it's or a political party, you want to invite them across the board. You want, so the first step is to make sure that you've invited everybody, and that could be everybody who is a candidate, or it could be everyone who is a viable candidate, and that's something we can talk about. I mean, for instance, if you have an election where there's 17 candidates, it may not be viable to have every candidate represented. We've seen that in California with respect to recall elections, right? Where sometimes we've had many candidates. You can't invite everybody. So the number one issue is you want to be as inclusive as possible. If you're not going to be as inclusive as possible, and then there needs to be an objective cutoff point that you've decided who to invite, not to invite. So can I jump in and ask, do parties even need to be at voter registration events? Because my first thought is, why don't you actually invite election officials or your local League of Women Voters? I think that maybe if it's just a voter registration event and not a candidate event, would you say that nonprofits might be better served not inviting political groups or candidates at all, just because it does introduce more higher standards of fairness and a little bit more headache, I'd say.
Well, that's a very good question. I'm sort of starting to assume that we're talking about some aspect of voter education, but you're absolutely right. If this is purely about voter registration, that's not typically where you would see candidates or parties be invited. And yes, I mean, there'd be additional risk because certainly in any voter registration activity, but this also holds true for an educational activity. You don't want any campaigning to go on at that
Right.
event. So I think the first question would be, why are they there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also had a question about voters who might want to register as unaffiliated. Can you encourage voters to affiliate with a party as long as, if you're not telling them which party to affiliate with, if you're just encouraging them? For instance, if you're in a closed primary state, would it be okay to say, hey, you can be unaffiliated, but you might really want to register with one party because you won't be able to vote in primaries otherwise?
Yeah, see, that's an interesting question. This gets the underlying theme of facts and circumstances, right? I mean, there's going to be questions where there's may not be affirmative guidance. And the question I think you always need to ask is this are you being helpful or to a specific candidate in the election or not? My initial reaction is it's to some extent seems like you are educating voters in terms of the voting process. And, if there's closed primaries, letting them know that if they don't pick a party, they won't be able to vote in the primary election. I think that would be fine, provided that you're doing that across the board. You're not trying different advice depending on whether it's one primary or another primary, or encouraging people to vote to join one party or another party. But if it's more generically I think the key is you want to provide that information objectively. And if you are encouraging people based on nothing to do with a specific candidate or election or party, I think you could do that. But I think the specific language is pretty important right there.
And we'll do one more.
Sure.
Can we have materials endorsing voting a particular way along with voter registration and get out the vote materials at a physical tabling event?
So voting in terms of campaign material, what kind of?
The question says, can we have materials endorsing voting a particular way?
Yeah. So I think the way we typically handle this is you don't want to have, if it's going to be voter registration or candidates there, you don't want to have any campaign related, voting a certain way, if that means voting for a particular person or party, that we would not want those materials there. Alternatively, you have everything, the concern is that you have materials only from one party or one side of the election, not the other. So typically we would say not to have those materials at all. I think there might be acceptable if everybody has the same, if there's materials from every candidate there, so that there's no support or bias towards one of the candidates over the other, that might be permissible as well. But again, you increase risk when you start to introduce that along with the voter registration or voter education. So there's additional risk that you might step over the line, and also someone may view that as stepping over the line, and you open yourself up to potential criticism, I think, if you include those materials with what should be a nonpartisan event.
Thank you. I think we'll let you get back to the slides. Folks can keep asking questions. I think I've seen a couple that I know you're going to address, okay. But folks, please keep on asking your questions. And back to you, David.
Great. I'm going to keep going to about 1:45, and then I will stop and take questions. So now we're talking about just candidate engagement, appearances, ways in which you actually have candidates involved directly with what the charitable organization is doing. So why don't we'll talk about candidate appearances, if you want to go to the next slide. This sort of sum up, and I'll kind of go past this because this sort of sums up what we're going to talk about, right? Being there in a candidate versus a non-candidate capacity, different ways in which a candidate can be involved, a debate versus a forum, and how we keep that nonpartisan. So this is kind of an overview slide. So why don't we jump right into candidate forums and go to the next slide. Okay, so this is an area where the IRS has given us guidance. And so here are steps to follow to stay nonpartisan when you want to engage candidates. You want to cover a range of issues or topics. Why? because the concern always with talking about issues and talking with elections at the same time is that somehow you are telegraphing to people how to vote based on their view of the issue. This gets particularly difficult if it's an issue-oriented organization. And, as I think we're increasingly seeing with Supreme Court decisions and the polarization on different issues, that more and more issues are becoming sort of more organizations may be viewed as single issue organizations, and more voters may be viewed as single issue voters. So if you are talking whether it's about reproductive rights or gun control, even how you refer to these issues will indicate what side of the issue you're on. If you were talking about one topic, there's a greater risk that you are going to telegraph people they should vote for the person on one side of the issue and vote for someone again who's on the other side of the issue. This is especially true when it's what we call a wedge issue, an issue that tends to divide the candidates. And as I was saying, more and more issues seem to be wedge issues these days. So when you're doing a forum, you want to cover a wide range of topics. This is the next point, is something that all the different things we look at, the general theme is equal opportunity. Everyone has equal opportunity to participate, and there's no implied approval or disapproval of a candidate. So let's talk about each one in just a little bit more detail. First of all, a key distinction is when you're inviting people, are you inviting them in a candidate capacity or in a non-candidate capacity? If it's a and this is important distinction to understand, when you're inviting someone, know which way you're doing it, because there may be reason to invite people to speak and give them a forum for nothing related to the election. They may be already in office, they may be an author, they may have other reasons why you would legitimately ask them to speak at your event. If that's the case, then you don't want any mention of their candidacy. You want the invitation to be based solely for reasons other than their candidacy. And in that event, to answer the earlier question, you wouldn't want any campaign materials allowed, period. I mean, the event is not about the candidate. However, and so there is a specific guidance on how you do that. And that person is there to not based on their candidacy and only to speak in a non-candidate capacity. And you don't want to mention the elections. On the other hand, a candidate also may be invited to speak in his or her capacity as a candidate. And that's more what I'll speak about now, which is, the point is to give the candidates a forum, to have a debate potentially. How do you do that? Well, the people are appearing in their candidate capacity, but you want to make sure that you conduct it like a nonpartisan event. Again, equal opportunity, what does that mean? It means as if you're doing a forum, for instance, where it's a series forum, where you're having a candidate in one event, and then the next time you'll have a different candidate, you want to make sure they're getting equal opportunity in terms of the time of the event and the likely turnout and the venue. So we often say, if you have an event on a Friday at 5 and you would have an event on a Tuesday at 11 p.m., that may not be equal opportunity. So, it's possible to have people at a series event, but the reason that it's charitable is that you were attempting to educate voters about these candidates and their positions so they can be an informed voter. You need to give equal opportunity to those candidates, however, and that means in terms of time they speak, but also time and place. And that's in contrast to a debate, which we could talk about briefly, where all the candidates are there at the same time. I've already mentioned you want to cover a broad range of issues. Invitations to all viable candidates. There is some guidance on this. Again, if it's just not viable to invite all the candidates because there's so many parties, then there needs to be a rough objective cutoff point where you decide who you're going to invite, who you're not going to invite. Keep in mind, anyone who doesn't get invited will be unhappy. So this does create risk, and you need to be prepared for the candidates who don't get invited to perhaps be critical of that decision. So you have to have I would say, a well-documented reason why you had a cutoff. Maybe it's a certain percentage of how they are faring in the polls. But some other, the basic premise is that to extent viable, you're going to invite everybody. It is when one of the candidates declines to speak, that is where you get into a more difficult situation, also related to an earlier question. Again, facts and circumstances. The IRS has said that if the organization includes a statement that somebody had declined to speak, and you make sure the invitation was equal for everybody, and you explain someone has declined to speak, and you do not indicate any view or judgment on that, you can still conduct the event. But if you're having an event with 2 candidates and only one agrees, there's really no way to do that without some risk involved. So you just have to, with respect to debate, you would have some difficulty holding that event if you only have one candidate appear. You might be able to do, we'll talk a little bit about voter guides where you just explain someone hasn't responded. But it would be difficult to give every candidate equal time and have a debate if you don't have a majority of the candidates appearing. So the key, I think, again, is to set the tone. You don't want to ask, in addition to equal time, there are also some guidance that you don't really want to ask candidates whether they agree with a specific position or platform, because again, whether they agree or disagree could telegraph approval or disapproval of that candidate. Debates are a thing in of themselves, and again, I think just in the interest of time, we'll move on. But the key points to keep in mind are just not showing any preference, giving everyone an opportunity to speak. And again, the one that maybe isn't as intuitive is asking a wide-ranging number of questions and covering a wide variety of topics. The narrower the topics, the greater the risk that it will appear that the organization is favoring or disfavoring the candidate based on their view on an issue. And you own a single issue. If you're educating voters, then the goal would be to cover a broader range of issues, and the IRS says that that's actually a factor that it will consider when looking at a debate or a forum. Okay, I think we should go on to the next slide. Okay, so quickly, let's talk about the voter guides and questionnaires. This is another great way to engage candidates and educate voters. You can compare the candidates in the race, usually based on the position on issues. Often the voter guide information is collected through a questionnaire. It's sent to again, same principle, all the candidates in the race receive that invitation. And then you're going to publish that information in an unbiased way, meaning you're going to cover, again, like a debate, you're covering a broad range of topics. Is the safest way to do it, with neutral questions, and you're going to publish the responses objectively. You should have clear guidelines on the responses you want. Maybe there's a word limitation, but you should publish what you receive without editorializing. The more you change it or summarize or don't verbatim provide the candidate's answers, the more you open the organization up to some risk that anything it had done to edit was not done in a fair way to the candidate. So often we would say if there's a word limit and the candidate exceeds that word limit, you just cut it off, the response at that word limit, rather than try to summarize. And just again, you're giving all the candidates equal opportunity to respond, and you're not being biased or unbiased. If you go to the next slide, you'll see an example of, sorry, oh, there it is, yeah. Okay, so here's an example of one answer on a voter guide that I think is an example as a charity is something that you would not want to do. And I like to show it because it's, again, it's getting more dated as we look at the timing since we used to do these presentations. But here, I mean, again, you have an issue, where do they stand? You see a check mark for support of the organization's position and the thumbs down for opposition. You see the description, stricter clean air health standards language that seems to indicate that is the way to go. Weakened clean air health standards, that seems to be very negative. It's a single issue, and you're indicating sort of where the organization stands on that issue. This would not be acceptable for a 501c3 voter guide. Why did it exist? Why do we see it? Well, this is the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club actually is a 501c4 organization, has more flexibility in how it conducts activities. This would be considered a partisan voter guide, however, because it's clearly telling voters how to vote. And so for organizations that want to have that latitude, maybe working with a 501c4 organization or having a 501c4 organization is the way to go. More flexibility, but again, a little beyond what we're going to talk about today. So again, stay on the safe side. You provide the question to all candidates. You don't want to hint the correct answer, and you really want to provide everything in an unbiased fashion, so you're educating voters, not suggesting support or opposition. I think with that, we should go to the next slide just to make sure we can get through these before we open up to questions. Quickly, comparing candidates. Covered a bit in voter guides discussion above. The key is it's okay to compare candidates in questionnaires, but you want to keep your opinion and the organization's opinion out of that publication. You can compare their voting records, you compare their views, but you're not telegraphing which candidate the organization prefers. With respect to criticism, you may correct a factual misstatement, but you should be careful not to make communications personal. You can correct factual statements, but you do not want to praise or attack a candidate. You want to focus only on the substance. So being critical of candidates definitely increases some risk. And the way a charity can do that, however, is to focus on issues, on policies. If someone is in office, you can talk and be critical about their policies, but you want to avoid attacking the person individually, saying they're not fit for office, for instance, or something else that is related to their candidacy. You can talk about why you don't like their policies, but not why you don't like them as a candidate. So sometimes that line can be fairly close. And so when you're being critical, you need to be careful. And along the same lines, ranking or rating candidates, this is actually not necessarily intuitive, but there is an IRS, or actually it's a court ruling that even publishing rankings or ratings of candidates, even if they were determined objectively, a ranking, a rating is going to implicitly indicate one candidate is better than another. That's not something a charity should do. And along the same lines, candidate pledges, asking a candidate to pledge to promise to support a charity's position if elected. You think that might be okay, it's on an issue, but the IRS takes the position that the purpose of that may be to publicize that the candidate supported your organization or didn't support your organization's position. And therefore, those who agree to pledge would be viewed in a more favorable light. And the implicit bias is that for those who don't pledge, that you are viewing that in a more negative light. And the IRS has taken the position based on some specific facts that have happened in the past that the point of asking for the pledge is to publicize it. So therefore, charities should not seek pledges from candidates. And that's a bit of a trap for the unwary because it's not immediately intuitive that that could be considered partisan activity. So I realize we're at 11:45. Do you want me to answer questions or talk about personal activities of candidates? I just know we're running short on time, so.
We have a lot of folks who are asking about wedge issues and ballot measures. So I think let's dive into that.
Let's dive into that. Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Issue advocacy and ballot measures. Now, the tax allows you to issue advocacy, but as I mentioned earlier, mixing issue advocacy with elections and candidates doesn't always mix well, because it is fine to use the occasion of an election to focus on your issue, get candidates to pay attention to your issue, to get some publicity. However, issue advocacy crosses the line into campaign intervention when the communication addresses an issue, but also seems to be telling the audience how to vote based on that issue. And so this is where, again, I mentioned facts and circumstances. This is probably where the facts and circumstances is the strongest or the hardest to determine, because it's you can do issue advocacy on one hand, but at what point are you really telling people how to vote when you haven't done that explicitly? We know a few things. We know the IRS is most likely to interpret issue advocacy as intervention when it's a high profile issue that tends to divide the candidates. So the way to think about it is the IRS has given us a list of facts and circumstances. And I'm going to run through what those are. For each one, it's somewhat of a balancing act. For every bad fact you have to say the risk is greater here that the IRS would interpret this as impermissible candidate intervention. So can we structure our communication in a way that we are reducing the risk factors as much as possible? So for instance, if you were going to talk about issue advocacy, if you were going to identify one or more candidates in the same communication, that creates additional risk. If you were going to express approval or disapproval of that candidate's position on an issue, that creates additional risk. The closer in time to the election of the issue advocacy, the greater the risk that it looks like your goal is to affect the election. So when you're talking about candidates close to an election and you're referring to the election, then these are all make issue advocacy. These are higher risk factors. Now, with respect to the issue, again, if it's what we call a wedge issue, an issue that tends to divide the candidates, then if you were talking about an issue that distinguishes the candidates, that also puts the communication at greater risk. So those are factors I just gave you that are all negative factors that would increase the risk that this issue advocacy is just too closely tied to the election, that there's some risk for the organization. What can you do to protect yourself? Well, the communication could be part of an ongoing series of communications on that same issue that were made before the election, during the election, and after the election. So track record is important. If you can develop, if you have an issue you care about and you continue to focus on that issue, you want to have as good a track record as you can, so the focus doesn't appear to be only before the election, which increases the risk. It looks like you're trying to impact the results of the election. Secondly, if the timing of the communication has to do with anything that's non-electoral, maybe there's legislation that's about to be voted on, or maybe there is this, some other timing that is not related to the candidate election, that you can rely on also is to justify why you are communicating about this issue now. So look for a non-electoral reason. Often that's a ballot measure or it's legislation. But you're looking at the question of timing, and you're looking at, in many cases, it's really the wording that you have to look at of the communication. Are you presenting the issue in as objective a way as possible? If you're talking about candidates, there's additional risk, and you really need to see why are you mentioning those candidates and what is the goal of the communication, other than educating the public about the issue, getting candidates to focus on the issue. But you don't want to suggest that voters need to vote a certain way based on that issue, or express disapproval or approval of a candidate based on the issue, because that just creates an additional risk for the organization. So I think with that, we can go to the next slide. I can talk a bit about ballot measures. Oh, I think this, so this covers a lot of what I was just talking about. So again, why don't we go to the next slide and cover ballot measures? Okay, very quickly, the IRS does not permit express advocacy. I'm sorry, the IRS does permit advocacy on ballot measures. Ballot measures are actually a legislative lobbying issue. So when an organization wants to support or oppose a ballot measure, that's actually legislation. Ballot measures are considered legislation for tax purposes. So we would look at the legislative lobbying rules and the lobbying limits for a particular charity. The reason we just think to make that clear, even though it's an election, this is a legislative lobbying activity for a charity. Secondly, it is possible ballot measures may be closely identified with the candidate, especially, for instance, if a candidate has a publicly endorsed or opposed a measure. So when you're dealing with a ballot measure, you have to think both about the legislative lobbying limits. Is this expenditure permissible for the charity? Does it have room under its lobbying limit, which again is a separate conversation and is not is a separate body of law with respect to candidate related activity. Secondly, the IRS will consider all the facts and circumstances in determining whether or not the ballot measure is too much tied to an individual candidate. That express, so the way you would protect yourself is, again, not mentioning the candidate in the communication and having a track record on this issue and on the ballot measure, so it doesn't appear that you're getting involved solely to influence the outcome of the election. And the third point I would just make here is that ballot measures do involve state, maybe local campaign finance rules. So we often advise organizations, they may be unaware, because charities are generally not involved in elections. They may be unaware that they're stepping into a highly regulated area. So if your organization wants to get involved in ballot measures, you likely will need counsel to make sure you're not inadvertently creating some reporting or registration requirement under state or local campaign finance laws that do apply to ballot measures. So I think after that, we're going to talk about what staff can or cannot do. But again, I want to open up for questions if you want me to. So, and I can go over a bit over the hour limit as well if there are additional questions.
Yeah, I do want to just go back to wedge issues a little bit. And there were a couple issues specifically brought up, including reproductive rights, disability rights and access, and changes around voting laws, whether it's voter access or voter suppression. So in general, are there any prohibitions on any of those topics? And do you have any general guidance about how you might communicate with voters if that is your issue at your organization or an issue you have a history with and you're doing voter outreach?
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to take one of these at a time, or I can just, well, just talk generally about, I mean, the problem we have now is that more and more of these issues, the ones you just raised, are going to be polarizing issues, right? They're going to be issues that candidates will have different views on, that people may vote on as well. So I think we have to live with the guidance that we have and the fact that because it's a facts and circumstances analysis, the risk changes with the situation on the ground. That being said, there are ways, and the other thing I should mention is there's a question of risk tolerance, right? I mean, an organization may decide it wants to get involved on these issues. Like I said, there's not a bright line, other than not explicitly endorsing or opposing a candidate. There's not going to be a bright line on what you can say and can't say. So steps you can take to mitigate the risk, I would say, is do you need to mention a candidate in that communication? And if so, why are you mentioning the candidate in the communication or the election? Number one. I mean, that's immediate. You immediately increase the risk when you're talking about, or you refer to the election and you refer to the issue in the same communication.
We had a good example of someone asking, can we say this? Let me see if I can find.
Yeah, with the understanding caveat here, of course, that I cannot provide legal advice on this webinar, and so these are, I can give you my opinions, but none of this, of course, should be construed as legal advice.
I think it was something to the effect of, can we say, like, vote for gun safety?
Yeah,
for instance.
And I would say, unfortunately, that is a wedge issue. There will be risk. I think if you are for instance, if you are in, and I think this is probably more elections than fewer these days, but if you are, where are you saying that? What is the election? If that is an issue that the candidates have clearly made their views expressed, and one is, and again, just referring to gun safety and how we frame the issues indicates what side of the issue you're on. But if you're in an election where this is an issue dividing the candidates, if you don't say vote for candidate A, but you say vote for gun safety, and candidate A is in favor of gun control legislation, then I think you will be telling people, and you can use a reasonable person test. But it's certain, if I was, the thing you could ask is, if I'm the voter, will I be receiving a message that I should vote for candidate A? And I think if it's an issue that divides the candidates, saying vote for gun safety will indicate to some voters they should vote for that candidate who's on that side of the issue. So yes, I do think there's risk there. And I think we're going to see a lot of that following the Supreme Court, this recent Supreme Court decisions, both on gun safety and reproductive rights.
All right. I want to make sure, I know some people are already having to drop off since we're close to the hour. I want to make sure you can talk quickly about what nonprofit staff can do, and then I'll come back to you with a couple more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize, time just flies by when you try to cover all this in an hour. But yeah, so why don't we just talk very quickly about stuff can do. I can cover this in 2 minutes or less, and then we can answer any additional questions. So what staff can do, you can go to the next slide. Excuse me. Basically, we're looking at two broad areas. One is it's important to understand that individuals don't lose their First Amendment rights to engage in political activities just because they're affiliated with a charity. So you're starting from the premise of individuals can personally be involved in political activities, as the key is that those activities cannot be attributable to the charity. So how do we avoid that attribution? Again, it's a recurring theme, but the IRS does look at all the facts and circumstances. So we want to make sure we're taking all the steps we can to separate the individual actions from the charity actions. And so to make sure that the staff and individuals are only acting in an individual capacity, one thing we look at is the use of the charity resources. So we want to separate the charity's resources from the individual's campaign as much as possible. So we don't want to use we don't want to use the organization's facilities or resources to support campaign work. If I'm an individual involved with the campaign, I should not be doing this on staff time or using charity resources to do my personal political work. And that includes things like printers and photocopiers and telephones. You want to separate and you should have, if you're going to have people who are engaged in this type of political activity, you may want to consider whether the organization should have a policy that lays this out clearly about what individuals can and cannot do, both to make sure people are aware of what they can and cannot do, but it's also going to be helpful protection if there's ever an audit or you get criticized in the press that you have told people, look, you can do these activities, but on your own time and not using charity resources. So number one, and we can go into more detail on any of this, but just in the interest of time, I'll focus on that one clear bucket, which is avoiding using charity resources for the campaign work. Secondly, you want to avoid attribution by just based on the person's role with the charity. So in other words, even if you're not using any charity resources, if that person is running for office or expresses political views, the question is whether or not there's going to be any reference to the charity at all that could suggest that the views are of the charity. And one thing you can do is whenever those individuals are making statements, they can provide very clear disclaimers that if the organization is mentioned, it's only for identification purposes only. You want to clearly, unambiguously state that the actions, the statements are not those of the charity. When we write these often, they'll say, look, as a charity, we cannot endorse or oppose candidates. These are my views. They're not the views of the charity. So we want to include disclaimers where possible. And, it's helpful to keep a record and watch the press to see if there's ever a reference that the charity, that a person's views were attributed to the charity. You may want to actually respond to the press and ask for, a retraction. And, most of the time, realistically, you're not going to get it. But if there's ever an audit, and I have been through one of these, and there's things in the press that suggest the organization was taking a political viewpoint when it was inaccurate or was from an individual, it's helpful in the record that you attempted to correct the record there. So I think we want to avoid attribution by using disclaimers. And we would say, if there are going to be statements by individuals, they should not be in publications of the charity or events of the charity. You want to keep it as separate from the charity as possible, and do it on your own individual time. So those are ways in which you can engage in your individual activity, but avoid having those activities attributable to the charity. Now, two things I'll say is facts and circumstances, and it can be as someone so heavily entwined with the political work that it may be difficult to keep the roles separate. That's a special case and you might need advice. And those situations I'm thinking of in particular when you have someone who's running for office themselves, and they're also a highly visible, maybe it's the executive director or other highly visible role at the charity. There may be circumstances where it's very hard to separate the candidacy from their work with the charity, in which case more steps may be necessary, even leaving the charity or resigning for a period of time. But that's just something to keep in mind. You have to look at all the facts and circumstances, and that does come up, but typically when someone running for office who also is sort of one of the lead executives for the charity at the same time. So I think I'll open up for questions at this point.
Great. All right. We still have a few questions rolling in. I know you're probably getting tired. Speaking for one solid hour is a lot. I know.
Well, it went a lot faster than I realized. I hope, there's a lot here to cover. So I'm happy to stay on and answer questions.
So let's see. These are going to be a little out of order, a little all over the place, hitting on various things. So if we did have someone ask if a volunteer holds a leadership position in a nonprofit, is the guidance different or the same as staff? Should they be following all the same rules?
Yeah, so you want to follow all the same rules. One difference may be the first point I raised about subsidy, about charity resources being used for an election-related activity. If somebody is a volunteer, of course, you don't have to worry about whether or not they're doing it on staff time, right? In other words, there's no money involved like there would be with an employee. If someone is employed and they're doing it, if they do it on staff time, then arguably the charity is subsidizing that. I would be careful though, whether it's an employee or a volunteer, it's the other side is the attribution issue. If they look like they're representing the charity, then they shouldn't be engaged in the political activities at the same time, and that could be volunteer or employee. So the same rules apply. I just think there's less of a risk that there could be an argument that charity is paying for subsidizing the activity when it's a volunteer instead of an employee.
We had someone ask about who can report violations of nonpartisanship. So if you work somewhere and you saw a nonprofit doing some partisan activity, can you report that to the IRS? What does that process look like?
Yes, so you can certainly report the activity to the IRS. There is, if you go to the website, and of course I don't have the link up top of my head, but I mean, there is a form actually that you can fill out to report activity to the IRS. There are a number of watchdog organizations that often do this and make it public, that will file complaints. And the bigger question is whether the IRS will do anything about that. We don't know. Certainly we have talked to regulators, both on the state and on the IRS side, where if there are complaints, that may be more likely to lead to an audit, but there's no guarantee. And if it does lead to an audit, the IRS won't tell you because it's a private taxpayer matter, at least until the audit's completed. So it's hard. So yes, you can file the complaints. There is a form to do it. If you go to the IRS website, you can find it. You may or may not, it's hard to know what will come of it, but one strategy organizations have done is to file a complaint and then just publicize it if they think an organization, because there could be a view in the court of public opinion before you ever get to an IRS audit that an organization's acting inappropriately.
All right, thanks for that. This is an interesting one. I think you're going to bring up, risk and risk mitigation, but is there danger in holding voter registration or conducting voter registration during rallies or marches around a wedge issue? And maybe I wonder if it's different,
That's a good issue.
if it really depends upon whether that is your issue,
Right.
that your organization regularly speaks out on, versus an issue that has nothing to do with your organization. Like, does that open you up to any extra scrutiny?
Yeah, that's a great question because, as you said, I think, you hear all these rules, and I've seen some comments come across that, we're concerned that there's greater risk for organization. And on one hand, can we say that there's no risk in that kind of activity? No, we can't say that there's no risk. However, there are steps you can take to protect the organization to engage in these activities and, be willing to live with a certain amount of risk. So to answer that particular question, I would say, voter registration is a charitable activity. I think what really matters is how you conduct that activity at that event. I don't think, in other words, that you'd be prohibited from engaging. If you were at a rally, if this is a place where you can get people registered, I'm not aware of any particular guidance on this point. And I would say on one hand, there's a greater risk because you're tied to a single issue, but on the other hand, if you are registering anybody and all comers and whether or not that happens to be people on a particular side of the issue because it's a rally, I still think it's legitimate charitable activity to get people registered. And so I think if you looked at all the facts and circumstances, I do think whether it's your issue or not would be relevant, right? Because if it's your natural constituency, I think, in other words, if you're a rally and it's a rally on your issue, I think you could register voters there. If you are going to other rallies based on a certain issue and just trying to register voters there that have nothing to do with your issue, that may look more like you are attempting to just register people on one side and not the other. So I know it's probably not a completely satisfying answer because it is facts and circumstances, but I think the way you have to look at it is, why are you registering those voters? And if it looks like you're just trying to register people on one side of the issue, I think you have greater risk. But on the other hand, if it's your issue and you're there, your environmental organization, and you're having a rally on your issue, and you're also registering voters there, I think you have a stronger argument that that's, I would say, is the natural constituency argument. They are people that are here because our issue, but we're registering everybody.
Great. All right, I've got one more, and this is a new one to me, but I think it's good because, you know, you mentioned right now everything is getting more polarized, and I think there are a lot of candidates who make bold statements that are not necessarily realistic policy proposals, but they're attention getting. So Adam gave a great example. Adam said, for education nonprofits, if a candidate says during a debate, let's get rid of the Department of Education, can the university say the next day, we support maintaining the Department of Education, without saying a word about the election or the candidate who made the comment? Would that be, you know, relatively safe, you think?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of other examples where, yeah, so a candidate will say something and then people will come out and say something else. A couple of thoughts. One is, yes, I think the question is about how you would do it, right? Number one, I think it's got to be a reaction to something the candidate has said, and it should be focused on the issue only without attacking the candidate. Number two, if to extent it's a factual issue, I think it's clear you can correct a factual misstatement. Now, what you're describing is not a factual misstatement, but more just we don't agree with the policy issue, right? And I do think if it is your issue, like I mean, if it was a specific issue and if the organization was completely unrelated to that issue, there may be more of a question of why you're speaking up now. But if it's about the Department of Education and you're an educational organization, yes, I do think you can respond to that issue focused on the issue. It's a policy question and not attack. The key is, I think, to avoid attacking that particular candidate. But I do think you are entitled to respond to an issue that's raised in a debate.
All right. Thank you, David, for spending this last hour and 20 minutes with us. Thank you to everyone who's attended the webinar and the 290 of you who stayed on past the hour. We will send out the recording, the slides, segments of the Q&A and the chat. So be on the lookout for those. For our attendees, please take a moment to fill out the very brief survey and give us some feedback. And again, thank you, David. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. You guys always ask great questions, and good luck to everybody. It's great. I hope everybody does get their charities involved in this coming election season, doing good nonpartisan work. So thanks for having me.
Thanks.